The rain had been falling over Seattle since morning, turning the streets outside Patty's kitchen into a blur of gray sidewalks, wet headlights, and tired people rushing home with their collars pulled high. For Cleo Hale, there was no rushing home. Home was a room above a closed laundromat with a heater that worked only when it felt generous. Home was a stack of overdue bills tucked inside a cracked drawer. Home was the quiet reminder that an Omega like him could work until his hands shook and still never quite catch up. So Cleo stayed behind the counter, wiping down the same spot for the third time because if he stopped moving, exhaustion would catch him. The old neon sign outside buzzed weakly through the rain. Patty's kitchen was not the kind of place wealthy people noticed. It was a narrow, aging diner on the edge of a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where nurses came after night shifts, delivery drivers came for coffee, and people with nowhere else to go came because Cleo never made them feel unwanted. The bell above the door chimed softly at exactly 9. Cleo looked up before the door even finished opening. "You're late tonight," he said, already reaching for 2 bowls. Samuel Rossi stepped inside first, holding the door open with one trembling hand. He was an elderly alpha, though age and hardship had worn him down until only traces of old dignity remained. His coat was thin, his posture tired, and his eyes carried the confusion of a man who was always searching for a memory he could not reach. Beside him was Rosalie Rossi, his Omega wife. She clutched an old handbag to her chest and looked around the diner as if she recognized it and forgot it at the same time. Samuel gave Cleo an apologetic smile. "The rain slowed us down. We can just have hot water tonight, Cleo. You have already done too much." Cleo placed 2 steaming bowls of minestrone on the counter and gave him a look. "If I have to throw this away, I will be personally offended." Samuel's smile softened. "You say that every night. And every night, you pretend to believe me." Rosalie's face brightened when she saw the soup. She moved carefully toward the corner booth, the one Cleo always kept clean and warm for them. "It smells like home," she whispered. Cleo paused for a moment. Rosalie said things like that sometimes. Little pieces of a life she could not explain. A house she could not describe. A son whose name came and went like a song half remembered. Cleo never pushed her. He only set the bread basket down gently and made sure her spoon was within reach. Samuel helped her sit, then lowered himself across from her with a quiet groan. "You need to take the blue pill after eating," Cleo reminded him. "Not before. The clinic doctor said it will upset your stomach." Samuel looked embarrassed. "You remember better than I do. That's why I wrote it on the envelope." Cleo pulled a small paper packet from beneath the counter and placed it beside the soup. He had picked up their medicine from the community clinic earlier that evening before coming to his second shift at the diner. It was not expensive medicine, but it still cost money, and Samuel had looked so ashamed when he tried to count coins into Cleo's palm that Cleo had lied and said the clinic covered it. It did not. But Cleo knew what it felt like to be sick and poor. He knew what it felt like when the world treated your survival like an inconvenience. The door behind the kitchen swung open, and Grant, the diner manager and Cleo's landlord, stepped out with a scowl. His eyes went straight to the old couple. "Cleo," he said sharply, "tell me you're not giving away food again." Cleo kept his voice calm. "It's leftovers. Leftovers still cost money. They already paid for tea." Grant looked at the 2 empty mugs on the table and laughed without humor. "Tea. Wonderful. Maybe tea can pay your rent too." Cleo's shoulders tightened. Samuel looked up immediately. "Is there a problem?" "No," Cleo said quickly. Grant leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it uglier. "You are 3 weeks late. I do not care how many sob stories you collect in here. By Friday, I want the money, or I change the lock on your room." Cleo swallowed. "I get paid Friday." "You always get paid Friday. Somehow you're still poor on Monday." Samuel began to push himself up, but Cleo placed a hand on the table before he could stand. "Please eat while it's hot." Grant sneered, then walked back toward the kitchen. "Your charity habit is going to bury you, Omega." The word landed harder than the rest. Cleo stood still until the kitchen door closed. Then he forced a smile and turned back to the couple. Rosalie was watching him with sad eyes. "People should not speak to you like that." "It's fine," Cleo said. Samuel's expression darkened with a flash of authority that did not match his worn clothes. No, it is not. For one brief second, Cleo saw something else in him. Not a homeless old man. Not someone lost. Someone important. Someone who had once been obeyed. Then the moment vanished, and Samuel looked down at his shaking hands as if he did not understand where that voice had come from. Cleo gently placed the medicine envelope beside him. Eat first. Fight the world later. Rosalie gave a small laugh and the tension eased. For the next hour, Cleo cleaned tables, refilled coffee for the last few customers, and checked on Samuel and Rosalie between tasks. By the time the diner finally emptied, Rosalie had grown sleepy, her head resting against Samuel's shoulder. She murmured something under her breath. Cleo leaned closer. Did you need anything? Rosalie blinked slowly. Pierce should eat too. Samuel froze. Cleo had heard the name before, but never this clearly. Who's Pierce? Cleo asked gently. Rosalie's eyes filled with confusion. My boy. Samuel rubbed his temple, pain tightening his face. Rosie, don't force it. I can see him, she whispered. He was standing near the window. He looked so lonely. Cleo felt a strange ache in his chest. He did not know who Pierce was, or whether he was real, dead, missing, or simply a broken memory Rosalie's mind had created to survive. But the grief in her voice was real. He packed extra bread into a paper bag and added the last orange from the fruit bowl. Take this for the morning, he said. Samuel looked at the bag and shook his head. Cleo, we cannot keep accepting this. You can and you will. You have your own troubles. Cleo smiled, but this time it was tired. Then let me have one thing in my life that feels right. Samuel said nothing after that. A few miles away, high above the city, Pierce Castelli stood inside a glass-walled office overlooking the wet skyline of Seattle. Castelli Biotech occupied the top floors of one of the most expensive towers downtown. The company was powerful, respected, and feared in equal measure. Its research shaped the medical future of alphas, betas, and omegas across the country. The CEO was known as brilliant, controlled, and impossible to move once he made a decision. Pierce had spent 5 years building an empire on top of grief. 5 years since the laboratory accident that killed his parents. 5 years since Samuel and Rosalie Castelli were declared dead after a chemical leak at a private research facility. 5 years since Pierce buried empty answers and learned to stop asking questions out loud. That night, a private investigator stood across from his desk with a tablet in both hands. I would not have brought this to you unless I was certain, the man said carefully. The facial match is not perfect because of age, malnutrition, and poor camera quality. But the system flagged both of them. Pierce did not move. On the tablet screen was a security image from a street camera outside a small diner. An elderly couple stood beneath a broken awning in the rain. The man held the woman's arm. The woman clutched a paper bag to her chest. And beside them, visible through the diner window, a young Omega was placing 2 bowls of soup on their table. Pierce's fingers tightened around the edge of the tablet. His breath stopped. The world he had built, the company, the money, the cold discipline that kept him standing, all of it seemed to tilt beneath him. His voice came out low and rough. Where is this diner? The investigator answered, but Pierce barely heard the address. He was staring at the woman in the image. The tilt of her head. The hand on the old man's sleeve. The way the Omega behind the window smiled at them like they mattered. Like they had not been forgotten by the world. Pierce turned toward the rain-dark city, his reflection sharp and pale in the glass. For 5 years, he had believed his parents were dead. And somewhere in Seattle, an Omega with tired eyes had been feeding them soup. Pierce Castelli did not sleep that night. Long after the private investigator had left his office, he remained standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle, replaying the image on the tablet again and again as though staring long enough might reveal some hidden mistake. For 5 years, every official report, every police file, every internal investigation had led to the same conclusion. Samuel and Rosalie Castelli were dead. The chemical leak had destroyed the facility, the evidence had been inconclusive, and eventually everyone, including Pierce himself, had been forced to accept what they could not prove. Yet the faces in the photograph were unmistakable. Older, thinner, worn down by hardship, but unmistakably his parents. Before sunrise, a convoy of black vehicles was already moving through the city toward Patty's kitchen. At the diner, Cleo was halfway through preparing the morning batch of soup when the bell above the entrance rang. He glanced up automatically, expecting a customer on the way to work, only to freeze when he saw several men in expensive suits enter first before stepping aside for a tall alpha whose presence immediately dominated the room. The entire diner seemed to grow quieter. Even without recognizing him, Cleo knew this was someone powerful. The alpha's tailored coat probably cost more than Cleo earned in several months. His expression was controlled, almost cold, but beneath that calm exterior there was something else. Something tense. Something desperate. Grant emerged from the kitchen instantly, suddenly much friendlier than usual. "Sir, welcome to Patty's. How can I help you?" The alpha barely looked at him. His eyes were fixed on the corner booth. Samuel and Rosalie had arrived earlier than usual that morning because the rain had stopped overnight. They were sharing toast and tea when Samuel slowly looked up. For several seconds nobody moved. Cleo felt a strange pressure building inside the room. The alpha took a step forward. Then another. Samuel stared at him with visible confusion. Rosalie tilted her head slightly. The alpha's voice came out lower than Cleo expected. "Papa." Samuel blinked. Nobody answered. The alpha swallowed hard. "Papa, it's me." The old man looked frightened rather than relieved. "I'm sorry," Samuel said quietly. "Do I know you?" The words landed like a physical blow. For the first time, Cleo noticed the way the alpha's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Not enough for most people to notice. But the pain was there. Something about the moment immediately put Cleo on edge. He stepped away from the counter and moved closer to Samuel and Rosalie without even thinking about it. "Maybe everyone should slow down," Cleo said carefully. Several of the suited men looked irritated. One of them took a step forward. "Stay out of this." Cleo folded his arms. "No offense, but a bunch of strangers just walked into the diner and started upsetting two elderly people. I think I'll stay exactly where I am." The room became very still. To Cleo's surprise, the alpha lifted one hand, silently stopping his men from speaking again. Then he looked directly at Cleo for the first time. Their eyes met. Cleo expected arrogance. Instead he found exhaustion. The alpha looked like someone who had spent years carrying something heavy and had suddenly been handed a reason to hope. "My name is Pierce Castelli," he said calmly. "I believe these two people are my parents." Grant nearly dropped a coffee mug. Several customers turned around immediately. Even Cleo felt his stomach tighten. Everyone in Seattle knew the Castelli name. Castelli Biotech was one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. Pierce Castelli appeared regularly in business magazines and financial news. He should not have been standing inside Patty's kitchen. Rosalie suddenly leaned forward. She studied Pierce's face carefully. Then her eyes widened. "Pierce." The room went silent. A trembling smile appeared on her face. "There you are." Pierce immediately dropped to one knee beside her booth. The movement shocked everyone. Powerful men were not supposed to kneel on diner floors. Yet Pierce looked as though nothing else in the world mattered. "Mama." Rosalie reached out slowly and touched his cheek. Tears filled her eyes. "You look tired." Pierce laughed once, though it sounded dangerously close to breaking apart. "I've been looking for you." Samuel continued staring. Confusion flickered across his face. Then pain. Then uncertainty. He pressed both hands against his temples. Fragments of memory seemed to collide inside his mind. Pierce. The name sounded unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. Suddenly his breathing became uneven. Cleo immediately moved closer. "Easy. Don't push yourself." Samuel grabbed the edge of the table. His eyes remained fixed on Pierce. Then, slowly, recognition appeared. Not complete recognition. Not certainty. But enough. "You're my son." Pierce closed his eyes. For several seconds he could not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Yeah." The simple word carried 5 years of grief. Cleo quietly stepped back, realizing he was witnessing something deeply personal. Even Grant had stopped talking. Nobody wanted to interrupt. The reunion was messy and imperfect, filled with missing memories and painful gaps, but it was real. After nearly 20 minutes, Pierce's private physician arrived. The elderly doctor spent time examining Samuel and Rosalie while Pierce remained nearby. Cleo returned to work, trying not to stare, though he kept glancing toward the booth. Finally, the doctor approached Pierce. "The good news is that they're alive." Pierce almost laughed. "The bad news? Years of untreated neurological damage, chronic stress, malnutrition, memory loss. Recovery won't be quick." Pierce nodded once. Then the doctor added something unexpected. "Whoever has been taking care of them deserves recognition." Pierce looked up. The doctor's gaze shifted toward Cleo. "If these two had continued living alone, I doubt they would have lasted much longer. Their medication schedule is organized. Their diet has been surprisingly balanced considering the circumstances. Somebody has been looking after them." Pierce followed the doctor's gaze. For a moment, Cleo wished everyone would stop looking at him. "I didn't do anything special," he muttered. The doctor disagreed. "You kept them alive." Those 4 words changed the atmosphere completely. Pierce stared at Cleo. Not as a stranger, not as a random diner worker, but as someone connected to the most important people in his life. The attention made Cleo uncomfortable. He immediately returned to wiping tables. Several minutes later, Samuel unexpectedly spoke. "No." Everyone turned. The old alpha was gripping Rosalie's hand tightly. "We're not leaving." Pierce frowned. "What?" Samuel looked genuinely distressed. "We stay here. Papa, you need medical care. Cleo is here." Rosalie nodded immediately. "Cleo stays." Pierce looked between them, then toward Cleo. Cleo nearly laughed from sheer disbelief. "Please don't involve me in this." "You have to come," Rosalie insisted. "You remind me of home." Cleo had no idea how to respond to that. The situation became increasingly ridiculous over the next hour. Every suggestion Pierce made about moving his parents to proper medical facilities was met with the same response. Only if Cleo came too. Eventually Pierce pinched the bridge of his nose. The gesture looked strangely human compared to the intimidating CEO image everyone knew. Then he looked at Cleo. "What would it take to convince you?" Cleo stared. "Convince me to do what?" "Come with us." "No." The answer arrived instantly. Pierce blinked. Apparently people did not tell him no very often. "I wasn't finished." "I was." Rosalie looked horrified. Samuel looked amused. For the first time all morning, Pierce almost smiled. Almost. Then his phone rang. He stepped away to answer. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When he returned, his expression had changed completely. The warmth from moments earlier disappeared. Business had returned. "Something happened?" the doctor asked. Pierce's jaw tightened. "One of our internal investigations uncovered new information." Samuel suddenly went pale. The reaction was immediate enough that everyone noticed. Pierce looked at him sharply. "What is it?" Samuel pressed a hand against his forehead. For several seconds he seemed lost inside his own thoughts. Then a single name escaped his lips. A name spoken with fear. A name that clearly belonged to a memory buried deep beneath years of damage. "Enzo." Pierce froze. Samuel's breathing grew heavier. His eyes widened. "Enzo Calberi." The room fell completely silent. Pierce's face lost all color. Because Enzo Calberi was not just another executive. He was one of the most powerful people inside Castelli Biotech. And for the first time in 5 years, Pierce had a reason to believe his parents' disappearance had never been an accident at all. The days following the reunion passed so quickly that Cleo often felt as though he had stepped into somebody else's life by mistake. Less than a week earlier, he had been worrying about overdue rent and whether he could afford another month of medication for Samuel and Rosalie. Now he was waking up inside one of the largest private estates in Seattle, surrounded by staff who addressed him politely and rooms larger than the entire apartment building where he used to live. Unfortunately, none of that made him feel comfortable. If anything, it made him more uneasy. Every hallway reminded him that he did not belong there. Every expensive painting, every formal dinner, Every servant who stepped aside when he passed seemed to reinforce the same message. You are only here because they need you. The thought followed him constantly. That morning, Cleo stood alone in the enormous kitchen preparing soup for Rosalie while several professional chefs watched with visible confusion. None of them understood why the elderly Omega refused to eat meals prepared by award-winning cooks yet happily finished every bowl Cleo made. Rosalie herself seemed unable to explain it. It tastes safe, she said simply whenever anyone asked. The answer somehow satisfied nobody except her. Cleo was stirring the pot when a voice spoke behind him. Dr. Rossi's blood pressure is much better today. Cleo turned and found a young beta leaning against the doorway. The man looked to be around 30, wearing glasses and a white medical coat. His smile was warm and easy. You must be Adrian. The beta nodded. And you must be the famous Cleo. Cleo groaned immediately. Oh no. They're talking about me already? They absolutely are. Adrian laughed before extending his hand. Adrian Calberry. One of the physicians overseeing Samuel and Rosalie's treatment. The surname caught Cleo's attention. Calberry? Adrian sighed. Unfortunately, yes. Cleo remembered the name from Samuel's breakdown several days earlier. Enzo Calberry. The executive whose name had shaken Pierce so badly. Before he could ask further questions, Adrian spoke again. My uncle and I aren't exactly close. Apparently he had noticed the reaction. That earned a small smile from Cleo. Good to know. Over the next few days, Adrian became a frequent presence around the estate. Unlike many of the employees who treated Cleo cautiously because of Pierce's involvement, Adrian spoke to him naturally. They often shared coffee during breaks, discussed Samuel's recovery, and occasionally exchanged stories about difficult patients from the community clinic where Cleo had once worked. The friendship was innocent. Unfortunately, not everyone seemed to see it that way. One afternoon, Cleo and Adrian were reviewing Samuel's medication schedule in the library when Pierce entered unexpectedly. The CEO had spent most of the week buried in meetings, legal consultations, and private investigations regarding Enzo Calberry, so his appearance immediately changed the atmosphere. Adrian smiled. Perfect timing. We were just talking about you. Pierce glanced from Adrian to Cleo. His expression remained calm. Too calm. I hope nothing serious. Actually, Adrian replied casually, I was inviting Cleo to dinner next week. The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. Cleo blinked. Dinner. Friendly dinner. Adrian corrected himself quickly. Unless you want it to be awkward now. Cleo laughed. Unfortunately, Pierce did not. Instead, he set a folder onto the table. Cleo already has plans next week. Cleo frowned. Ido. You do now. This time Adrian laughed openly. Pierce looked completely unbothered. At least outwardly. The moment should have been amusing. Instead it lingered in Cleo's mind long after both men left. For reasons he could not explain, the idea of Pierce sounding irritated over something so harmless made his chest feel strangely warm. Meanwhile, trouble was quietly building outside the estate. The media had finally discovered that an unidentified Omega had been living under the same roof as Pierce Castelli. At first it was nothing more than gossip. Then photographs appeared. Then speculation. Then endless articles. By the end of the week, social media seemed obsessed with one question. Who was Cleo Hale? Some reports described him as Pierce's assistant. Others claimed he was a secret partner. Several suggested he was manipulating the CEO. The more ridiculous the rumor became, the faster it spread. Cleo hated every second of it. You should stop reading comments. Pierce spoke without looking up from his tablet. They were sitting across from each other during breakfast. Cleo immediately closed his phone. I wasn't reading comments. You looked offended. They said I was after your money. Pierce finally glanced up. Considering you refused to spend mine, that theory seems weak. Despite himself, Cleo smiled. Then the smile faded. They aren't completely wrong about one thing. Pierce raised an eyebrow. I don't belong here. The answer came so quietly that even Cleo surprised himself. The room fell silent. For a moment, Pierce simply watched him. Then he placed the tablet aside. Cleo, look around. Cleo gestured toward the dining room. The people who live in this world are executives, investors, politicians, alpha heirs. I spent most of last year calculating whether I could afford groceries and rent in the same month. That doesn't make you less valuable. Maybe not to you. Pierce held his gaze. Especially not to me. The words settled heavily between them. Neither said anything else. Yet neither looked away. The moment was interrupted by Rosalie entering the room with Samuel close behind. Fortunately for both of them, because Cleo suddenly had no idea what to do with his heartbeat. A few days later, Pierce attended one of the largest charity galas in Seattle. Normally he would have gone alone. This year, however, Rosalie insisted on attending. And if Rosalie attended, she wanted Cleo there. Nobody managed to win that argument. By evening, the ballroom was filled with executives, investors, politicians, and influential alpha families. Cleo felt uncomfortable the moment he entered. The expensive clothing helped very little. He still felt like an outsider. Unfortunately, several guests clearly agreed. The trouble began with whispers, then stares, then comments loud enough to hear. One alpha executive looked directly at Cleo while speaking to a group of investors. I suppose standards have become very flexible these days. Several people laughed. Another added, perhaps being poor is fashionable now. Cleo tried to ignore them. He truly did. But years of hearing similar things made it impossible not to feel the sting. One final remark changed everything. A middle-aged alpha approached openly. His smile was polite. His words were not. A working-class Omega has no place beside the Castelli family. The ballroom seemed to freeze. Cleo felt every eye in the room turning toward him. The humiliation burned hotter than anger. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the silence. Then perhaps I'm attending the wrong event. The alpha's smile disappeared instantly. Pierce had stepped forward. His expression remained calm, but everyone could feel the warning beneath it. The room went completely quiet. Pierce moved until he was standing beside Cleo. Not in front. Not behind. Beside. Then he addressed the entire room. Cleo has done more for my family than most people in this building combined. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. If anyone believes his background determines his worth, feel free to continue the evening without me. Several investors immediately looked horrified. The executive responsible for the insult went pale. Without another word, Pierce offered Cleo his arm. Let's go. The drive back to the estate was quiet. Cleo stared out the window while city lights passed by outside. Eventually he spoke. You didn't have to do that. Pierce's answer came immediately. Yes, I did. Cleo looked at him. Pierce looked forward. His hands remained folded calmly in his lap. But his jaw was tight, as though he was still angry. Not at Cleo. At what had happened. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Cleo felt something shift. Not because Pierce was wealthy. Not because he was powerful. But because when the entire room had looked down on him, Pierce had never hesitated. Hours later, after returning home, Samuel suddenly froze while reviewing old photographs with Rosalie. A sharp pain crossed his face. The photo slipped from his fingers. Rosalie rushed toward him. Samuel? His breathing became uneven. Fragments of memory crashed together inside his mind. Voices. Warning alarms. A laboratory. The smell of chemicals. Then one face. One name. Samuel looked up in terror. It wasn't an accident. Pierce immediately stood. What wasn't? Samuel's trembling gaze locked onto his son's face. The leak. The room fell silent. Then Samuel whispered the words that changed everything. I remember the laboratory. And for the first time in 5 years, a piece of the truth finally began to surface. The atmosphere inside the Castelli estate changed after Samuel's sudden breakthrough. Until that night, everyone had been moving forward based on fragments, guesses, and possibilities. But now there was finally something concrete. Samuel remembered the laboratory. He remembered the chemical leak. More importantly, he remembered enough to believe the disaster that had supposedly killed him and Rosalie had not been an accident. For Pierce, that single realization became impossible to ignore. Within 48 hours, he had quietly assembled a private legal team, hired independent investigators, and ordered a confidential review of internal company records dating back 5 years. Officially, nothing unusual was happening inside Castelli Biotech. Unofficially, Pierce was digging through the foundations of his own company. The problem was that every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. Several key files had disappeared. Entire communication records were missing. Research logs from the period surrounding the accident contained unexplained gaps. Someone had clearly cleaned up the trail. And the deeper Pierce looked, the more frequently one name appeared. Enzo Calberi. Cleo could see the pressure building day by day. Pierce still attended meetings, still handled shareholders, still managed a billion-dollar corporation, but exhaustion was beginning to show around the edges. Some nights he returned home long after midnight. Other nights he worked from his office until sunrise. The worst part was that he rarely complained. One evening Cleo found him sitting alone in the library with several reports spread across the table. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. "You know, normal people sleep occasionally." Pierce looked up from the documents. "I wasn't aware CEOs qualified as normal people." "That's not the part one was questioning." A faint smile touched Pierce's face. The expression disappeared quickly, but Cleo noticed it. Over the past few weeks, something had changed between them. Neither had acknowledged it directly, yet the distance that once felt enormous was slowly shrinking. Conversations came easier. Silences felt comfortable. Sometimes they simply sat together without speaking. For someone like Pierce, who seemed isolated from everyone around him, those quiet moments carried more meaning than either of them admitted. Cleo placed a bowl on the desk. Pierce frowned. "What is this?" "Dinner. It looks suspiciously like soup." "It is soup." Pierce leaned back in his chair. "You realize my kitchen employs professional chefs. And somehow you're still forgetting to eat." That earned another reluctant smile. Pierce picked up the spoon. Several minutes later the bowl was completely empty. Cleo crossed his arms. "You always complain first and finish it anyway." Pierce glanced at the empty bowl. "I never said your cooking wasn't effective. You make it sound like medicine. Considering how often it fixes problems around here, maybe it is." The conversation should have been ordinary. Instead, it lingered in Cleo's thoughts long after he left the library. Lately, more and more moments felt that way. Meanwhile, Samuel's condition continued to improve. His memory did not return all at once. Instead, it arrived in scattered flashes that often left him exhausted afterward. Sometimes a smell triggered something. Sometimes a photograph. Occasionally, a random conversation unlocked an entire sequence of forgotten events. Unfortunately, many of those memories brought fear with them. One rainy night Samuel woke from a nightmare so severe that Rosalie immediately called for help. By the time Cleo reached the room, Samuel was shaking. His pulse was dangerously elevated. His breathing was uneven. Adrian arrived moments later to assist. The episode lasted nearly an hour before Samuel finally calmed down. Only after the doctors confirmed he was stable did everyone allow themselves to relax. Rosalie eventually fell asleep beside her husband. Adrian returned to the medical wing. The house became quiet. Pierce and Cleo remained sitting outside Samuel's room. Neither seemed eager to leave. "He looked terrified," Cleo said softly. Pierce stared at the closed door. "I've never seen him afraid before." The answer carried more weight than the words themselves. Cleo understood what he meant. The Samuel he knew was kind and gentle. The Samuel Pierce remembered had once built one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. Watching that man frightened by his own memories was painful. For several moments neither spoke. Then Pierce rubbed his eyes. The movement revealed just how exhausted he was. Without thinking, Cleo removed his own jacket and draped it over the back of Pierce's chair. Pierce looked surprised. "You'll be cold. You look worse." That actually made Pierce laugh. A genuine laugh. Not the polite version most people received. The sound was warm enough to make Cleo suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting. Neither moved away. Hours later, both eventually fell asleep in the chairs outside Samuel's room. The next morning they woke to find Rosalie standing over them. The older Omega looked delighted. She immediately covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing. Unfortunately, she failed. You two look adorable. Cleo nearly fell out of his chair. Pierce looked horrified. Rosalie laughed even harder. For the rest of the day she refused to let either of them forget it. Even Samuel seemed amused. The rare light-heartedness helped everyone breathe again. Unfortunately, it did not last. 3 days later, another memory surfaced. This one changed everything. Samuel had been sitting in the garden when he suddenly asked to speak with Cleo alone. The request surprised everyone. Even more surprising was Samuel's expression. He looked focused. More focused than he had been in years. "Cleo," he said quietly, "do you remember the box?" Cleo frowned. "What box?" "The metal box." At first nothing came to mind. Then realization struck. Years ago, before Samuel's memory had deteriorated completely, there had been a brief period when he was far more coherent than usual. During that time he had entrusted Cleo with a small metal container. At the time, Samuel seemed frightened. He had insisted that Cleo hide it. More importantly, he had made him promise something. "If a man named Pierce Castelli ever finds me, give it to him." The memory rushed back all at once. Cleo stared. "Oh my God." Samuel nodded. "You remember." Cleo did. The box was still hidden exactly where he had left it. Back inside his old apartment. The apartment he had not visited since moving to the estate. Pierce immediately arranged transportation. Less than an hour later they arrived at the building. Walking through the neighborhood felt strange after weeks inside the world of the Castellis. Everything seemed smaller, poorer, familiar. The box was exactly where Cleo had hidden it, wrapped in an old blanket beneath a loose floorboard. Nobody spoke during the drive back. The tension inside the vehicle felt almost unbearable. When they finally returned to the estate, Pierce carried the box directly into his office. Samuel, Rosalie, Adrian, and Cleo gathered around as he carefully opened it. Inside sat a portable hard drive. Nothing more, nothing less. Years of mystery reduced to a device small enough to fit inside one hand. Pierce connected it to his computer. The screen loaded. A series of encrypted files appeared. Samuel's face drained of color. He recognized them immediately. "They're real." Pierce opened the first folder. The room became silent. Page after page appeared across the screen. Research reports, internal communications, safety evaluations. Then came the data, actual trial results. Not the public versions. The originals. Cleo watched Pierce's expression change as he read. Confusion. Shock. Disbelief. Then anger. Cold and terrifying anger. Finally Pierce looked up. Nobody liked what they saw in his eyes. "What is it?" Cleo asked. Pierce swallowed once. "The medication." His voice sounded almost distant. "The omega suppression drug." Nobody spoke. Pierce turned the monitor toward them. The trial results were falsified. A terrible silence filled the room. Samuel closed his eyes, as though he had been expecting this answer all along. Pierce stared at the files. Then at the company logo visible in the corner of every document. The company his father built. The company he now led. The company that might be standing on a lie. And buried somewhere inside those files was enough evidence to destroy everything. Pierce barely slept during the week that followed. The hard drive had answered the question that had haunted his family for 5 years. But the answer was worse than any of them had imagined. The files proved that the omega suppression medication currently preparing for nationwide release had been approved using manipulated trial results. Severe long-term complications had been hidden, safety reports had been altered, and multiple internal warnings had disappeared from official records. Every trail eventually led back to Enzo Calberi. The problem was that exposing the truth would not only destroy Enzo, could destroy Castelli Biotech as well. For several days, Pierce locked himself inside conference rooms with lawyers, auditors, regulators, and board members. Arguments erupted behind closed doors. Investors called constantly. Senior executives demanded explanations. Cleo saw the effects even when Pierce tried to hide them. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes. Meals were skipped. Conversations became shorter. The pressure surrounding him seemed almost visible. One evening Cleo found him alone on the terrace overlooking the lake behind the estate. The city lights shimmered in the distance while cold wind rolled across the water. Pierce was staring into the darkness. Not working. Not reading. Simply staring. Cleo walked over quietly and handed him a cup of coffee. "You look terrible." Pierce accepted the cup. "Thank you. That's exactly what every man wants to hear." Cleo leaned against the railing beside him. "You know what I mean." "Ido." For several moments neither spoke. Eventually Pierce exhaled slowly. "If I release everything, thousands of people will know the company lied." Cleo remained silent. "If I don't release it, thousands of Omega patients may continue using a medication that never should have been approved." The words sounded simple. The reality behind them was not. This was not merely a business decision. It was a choice between protecting a company and protecting people. "What would your father do?" Cleo asked. Pierce lowered his eyes. The answer came immediately. "He would expose it." "Then you already know what you have to do." Pierce looked toward him. For a brief moment the distance between CEO and diner worker disappeared completely. Only two exhausted people remained. "I don't know when your opinion became the one that matters most." The confession was quiet, almost accidental, yet it stayed with Cleo long after they returned inside. 3 days later the decision was made. Pierce called a press conference. News outlets from across the country arrived. Investors panicked. Board members demanded emergency meetings. Enzo himself personally requested that Pierce reconsider. The two men met privately the night before the announcement. Enzo entered Pierce's office carrying decades of authority and influence. He left with neither. "You are making a mistake," Enzo warned. Pierce remained seated behind the desk. "No. The mistake happened 5 years ago. You think the public cares about ethics?" "Icare." Enzo laughed bitterly. "Your father built this company to change the world. Tomorrow you may destroy everything he spent his life creating." Pierce's gaze hardened. "My father built this company to help people. You turned it into something else." The next morning Pierce released every document, every report, every trial result, every hidden warning. The reaction was immediate. News channels interrupted programming. Share prices collapsed. Regulators launched investigations. Public outrage exploded. By evening, Castelli Biotech had lost billions in market value. The board of directors convened an emergency vote. 48 hours later, Pierce was temporarily removed as CEO pending further review. The headlines dominated every screen. The golden CEO who brought down his own empire. Castelli Biotech crisis deepens. Questions about CEO's judgment continue. Unfortunately, the attacks did not stop there. Soon a different narrative emerged. Certain executives quietly began suggesting that Pierce's decisions had been influenced by Cleo. Anonymous sources leaked stories. Commentators speculated. Online discussions became increasingly vicious. The same accusation appeared everywhere. An alpha heir had sacrificed his company because he was obsessed with an Omega. At first Cleo tried to ignore it. Then he overheard 2 employees discussing it during a medical appointment. Then he saw investors openly blame him. Then he noticed how exhausted Pierce looked every time another article appeared. Eventually the guilt became impossible to ignore. Late one night, Cleo stood alone in his room staring at the packed travel bag resting on the bed. The decision felt unbearable, but staying felt worse. If he disappeared, perhaps things would calm down. Perhaps Pierce could focus on rebuilding his life. Perhaps people would stop using him as a weapon. By midnight, the estate had fallen silent. Cleo carried the bag downstairs. His chest hurt with every step. He had spent weeks convincing himself that he did not belong there. Now leaving felt far more painful than staying. He reached the front entrance. Then a familiar voice stopped him. "Where are you going?" Cleo froze. Pierce stood at the bottom of the staircase. He looked exhausted. His tie was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. For the first time in weeks, he did not look like a powerful executive. He looked like a man who had already lost too much. Cleo lowered his eyes. "You should be resting. Answer the question." The calmness in Pierce's voice somehow made everything worse. Cleo tightened his grip on the travel bag. They blame me. I don't care. I don't care. You lost your company. That finally made Pierce angry. Not explosive anger. Something quieter. More dangerous. His eyes locked onto Cleo's. I lost a title. The words struck harder than any shout. Pierce crossed the remaining distance between them. You think that's why I'm upset? Cleo could not answer. You think after everything that's happened, after everything we've been through, the thing that matters most to me is a job? Emotion cracked through the control Pierce normally maintained. For the first time since they met, he looked completely honest. Completely unguarded. Cleo's heart ached. Pierce.
No.
Pierce shook his head. I'm tired of pretending this is only about gratitude. The silence between them felt endless. Then Pierce stepped closer. Close enough that neither could look away. The truth is that somewhere between those late-night conversations and those terrible bowls of soup, I fell in love with you. Cleo's breath caught. Every argument he had prepared vanished instantly. You deserve someone better. The protest sounded weak even to his own ears. A faint, sad smile appeared on Pierce's face. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. His hand gently closed around Cleo's. You are the first person who ever cared about me before knowing who I was. The emotional wall Cleo had spent years building finally shattered. Before he could overthink it, Pierce pulled him closer. Their first kiss was not dramatic. It was not fueled by pheromones or destiny. It was built from trust, grief, loyalty, and weeks of feelings neither had been brave enough to name. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke. Neither needed to. For the first time in a very long time, everything felt clear. Then Pierce's phone began ringing. The sound shattered the moment. He glanced at the screen. His expression immediately changed. What is it? Cleo asked. Pierce slowly lowered the phone. A dangerous smile appeared on his face. The regulators just opened an official criminal investigation into Enzo Calberi. And for the first time since the truth came out, it looked like justice was finally coming. The weeks that followed felt very different from the chaos that had consumed the Castelli family for months. The criminal investigation into Enzo Calberi moved quickly once regulators gained access to the original files, and every new discovery seemed to confirm what Samuel had been trying to expose years earlier. Internal emails, hidden reports, falsified trial data, and financial records painted a clear picture of a man who had prioritized profit over patient safety for far too long. The public reaction remained fierce, but for the first time the anger was directed toward the people truly responsible. Enzo resigned before formal charges could be announced. Several senior executives followed. Shareholders demanded reform. Industry analysts predicted the company would spend years recovering. Yet despite the financial damage, something unexpected happened. Public trust slowly began returning. People respected the fact that the truth had been exposed instead of buried. Doctors publicly supported Pierce's decision. Patient advocacy groups praised the transparency. Even some investors who had originally opposed him eventually admitted he had made the correct choice. For Pierce, however, the most important victory had nothing to do with business. Every morning he woke up knowing his parents were alive. That alone felt like a miracle. One bright afternoon several months later, Samuel sat comfortably in the estate garden while Rosalie read aloud from a magazine she barely paid attention to. Their recovery remained imperfect, but it was real. Some memories never returned. Others came back in fragments. There were still difficult days and moments of confusion, but they were no longer lost and alone. Cleo often found himself watching them from a distance. Every time he did, he remembered the cold nights at Patty's kitchen, the paper bags of leftover bread, and the countless times Samuel had insisted he was becoming a burden. Now they were safe. That thought alone made everything worthwhile. You know they're looking for you. Cleo turned to find Adrian approaching with 2 cups of coffee. Who is? Your family. The word still surprised him. Family. Not employers. Not benefactors. Family. Adrian handed him one of the coffees before sitting beside him on a nearby bench. The friendship between them had remained strong despite everything that happened. There had never been bitterness or rivalry after Pierce and Cleo became a couple. If anything, Adrian seemed relieved the uncertainty was finally over. You seem happy, Adrian observed. Cleo smiled slightly. I am. Good. The beta raised his cup. You deserve that. Before Cleo could respond, another voice interrupted. I appreciate the sentiment. Pierce appeared from the opposite path. Adrian immediately groaned. There he is. Pierce looked entirely unashamed. Adrian pointed toward his watch. You've interrupted 3 conversations this month. I've been keeping count too. Cleo covered his face. Neither man seemed interested in behaving like adults. Fortunately, Adrian eventually stood and excused himself before either of them could become more ridiculous. Once he was gone, Pierce sat beside Cleo. The comfortable silence that followed felt natural now. Months earlier it would have been awkward. Now it felt like home. You had a meeting today. I did. How bad was it? Pierce leaned back against the bench. The board voted. Cleo immediately looked at him. The question they had both been avoiding finally had an answer. And a slow smile appeared on Pierce's face. They want me back. For a moment Cleo simply stared. Then he laughed. Not because the news was surprising. Because it felt right. The company had nearly collapsed. Pierce had lost his position. Everyone told him he was destroying his future. And somehow he had still ended up exactly where he belonged. What are you thinking? Pierce asked. Cleo looked toward the garden where Samuel and Rosalie sat together. I'm thinking your father would be proud. The answer hit harder than expected. Pierce's expression softened immediately. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. I hope so. The return to Castelli Biotech happened gradually. This time Pierce refused to rebuild the company the way it had been before. Entire departments were restructured. New oversight programs were introduced. Independent safety reviews became mandatory. Most importantly, a new initiative focused on Omega healthcare and advocacy was launched. When Pierce first proposed it, some board members questioned whether it would be profitable. His answer was simple. Not everything valuable needs to maximize profit. The statement quickly became famous inside the company. A few months later, another project quietly opened its doors. Unlike the corporate announcements and media coverage surrounding the company reforms, this project was much smaller, much simpler, much more personal. Rosalie's Hearth. The restaurant stood on a corner property near the main Castelli campus. It wasn't luxurious or exclusive. There were no celebrity chefs or expensive tasting menus. Instead, it served warm meals, affordable prices, and the same kind of comfort food Cleo had once cooked in a struggling diner. The grand opening attracted far more attention than anyone expected. Employees arrived in large numbers. Local residents stopped by. Reporters showed up hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous CEO and his Omega partner. Cleo hated every second of the attention. Pierce enjoyed watching him pretend otherwise. By lunchtime, the restaurant was packed. Cleo stood behind the counter trying to keep orders organized when Rosalie suddenly appeared beside him. Her eyes sparkled mischievously. Look! Cleo followed her gaze. Pierce had just entered. Several empty tables remained available throughout the dining room. Naturally, the CEO ignored every one of them. Instead, he walked directly toward the counter. You own part of this company, Cleo said. I know. You could eat anywhere. I could. You came here again. Pierce nodded seriously. The chef is attractive. Rosalie laughed so loudly that several customers turned around. Cleo nearly dropped a serving tray. Samuel looked equally amused from his table near the window. Life was not perfect. There were still challenges ahead. Samuel's memory might never fully recover. The company would continue rebuilding for years. The world would always contain people eager to judge an alpha CEO for loving a former diner worker. Yet somehow none of those things felt important anymore. As evening approached, the restaurant slowly emptied. The final customers left. The lights softened. Outside, Seattle glowed beneath the setting sun. Inside, Samuel and Rosalie sat together sharing dessert. Adrian occupied a nearby booth. Pierce remained at the counter. Cleo looked around at all of them and felt something settle quietly inside his heart. For years he had believed he was merely surviving. For years he had convinced himself that people eventually left, that nothing good lasted, that someone like him would always remain on the outside looking in. He understood now how wrong he had been. A simple act of kindness had changed everything. A few bowls of soup had saved 2 lives. Those 2 lives had led him here, to a family, to a future, to love. Pierce reached across the counter and took his hand. This time neither of them cared who was watching. And surrounded by the people who mattered most, Cleo finally realized that he was exactly where he belonged. And so, what began with a simple bowl of soup became something far greater than any of them could have imagined. Thank you for joining me on this journey of family, healing, courage, and love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the power of kindness.